Right now, I would like to introduce Alan and John, and they'll be talking about bringing .NET Interactive support to Azure Data Studio notebooks.
Hello, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our wonderful session here. It's a pleasure to present all the really awesome partnerships that we've done over the past 4 months between Azure Data Studio and .NET Interactive. And we really want to show a bunch of the work that we've been doing with notebooks across Microsoft through this presentation. To kind of start off, my name is Alan Yu. I'm a program manager on the Azure Data Studio team.
And I'm John Sakura, and I'm the dev lead on the .NET Interactive team.
And throughout this presentation, you're going to be able to see, at least a little bit of the ideas of why notebooks are a very important concept, and especially of having a better SQL experience in notebooks, while also being able to see a plethora of demos across both Azure Data Studio and Visual Studio Code. So let's kind of just start off really briefly. I don't want to spend too much time talking about what is Azure Data Studio, but to kind of understand the motivations behind it. The Azure Data Studio team not only works in Azure Data Studio, but also works on tools that you might already be familiar with, like SQL Server Management Studio and SQL Server Data Tools, SSDT. And what this means is that we work very closely with SQL Server and Azure SQL to go and build really great SQL experiences. Now, over time, as SQL has kind of evolved and also our customer base has evolved, where they are all over the place. They're on Mac OS, they're on Linux, they're on containers. With the release of SQL Server 2017, this was the first time that SQL Server is available on Linux and on containers, which is just crazy to think about. But it also meant that our tooling also had to evolve, where, as you may know, SSMS only works on Windows. So how can we have a cross-platform open source tool that allows you to work with SQL Server, Azure SQL, and other Azure data services? So we went ahead and created Azure Data Studio, which is open source and cross-platform and is actually a fork of Visual Studio Code. In terms of the main personas for Azure Data Studio, the main data personas are kind of like the database administrators, the database developers, and the data analysts. And it's really like anyone that's really working with SQL. And you can see that we support things like SQL Server and Postgres and eventually MySQL and as well Data Warehouse. And this kind of represents what Azure Data Studio looked like for a very long time. Now, since we work very closely with SQL Server, with the release of SQL Server 2019, this allowed for the very first time where you're able to ship both SQL Server and Spark together. And what this meant is on the experiences side, we had to think about new personas, such as the data engineers and the data scientists who need the ability to manage things like Spark jobs and be able to virtualize data for Teradata and things like that. And as we thought about this persona, we thought, what experience do data scientists absolutely need? And when we looked, we realized that we needed to bring Jupyter Notebooks into Azure Data Studio, which didn't exist at the time. And before we go into a little bit of the development and the motivations for building notebooks inside of Azure Data Studio, here are some of the principles that I wanted to share with you as we, over the last few years, tried to learn about this new world where we're not only building Windows tooling. One thing is that we want to leverage open source as much as possible. We don't want to be creating experiences that only work in the Microsoft ecosystem, but kind of think about how do we be good open source community members? How do we not only build things or take things from the open source community, but also contribute back? On top of that, notebooks is essentially, or Jupyter Notebooks is essentially an open source concept. And so that means there's so many other Jupyter viewers out there in the world. So we want to really make sure that anything that we build, we want to optimize for backwards compatibility. So if you have your notebooks, or the data scientist already has all these notebooks already, and were to use it in Azure Data Studio, that it will just work seamlessly. Or if they started and created their notebooks in Azure Data Studio, they could then go use that in anywhere else. And then finally, our engineering approach is very much this crawl, walk, run philosophy, where we want to just iterate very quickly, ship out incremental experiences, and always be talking back to our customers, getting validation from them, and figuring out the experiences that we really need to go and build a beautiful experience for. And so, for those of you that aren't familiar with notebooks, it's a concept that data scientists are very familiar with, but basically it's all about having these reproducible data sets so that you can then, basically tell a story with it. Notebooks really consist of two main things. One is that they have executable computer code cells. So in this example, if you're executing Python, you could be able to run it within the notebook and get the live output of it. And then in addition to that, we allow for accompanying having rich text cells. So you can have rich formatting that instead of just having like a Python level code or code comments, you can have this rich formatting to kind of accompany and include tables or images or GIFs to kind of accompany the data that you're trying to share with anyone else on your team. And so that's kind of what we first thought when we created notebooks in Azure Data Studio, where we need to optimize for the data scientists who need to be able to execute Python inside of a notebook. And that's kind of where we really put all of our energy towards. But as you know, and this is why I brought up SQL earlier, there's already this rich ecosystem of people that are already using the tool and using SSMS, who are the DBAs. And they saw this new experience that we're building for the data scientists. And they were like, I actually like this a lot. Can we use SQL with this? And, how can I start using SQL with this? And, they said they liked it. We showed them like SQL magic is kind of an incremental experience, but, they were kind of all telling us the same thing. They wanted to basically feel like they're writing these notebooks as if they're writing in a query editor itself. So they want syntax highlighting. They want IntelliSense. They want an interactive results grids. And having magic wasn't enough for them. In fact, them having to learn Python was very intimidating. We're having to manage these Python dependencies. So this helped us as a team kind of prioritize, let's not only think about the data scientists, but let's also think about the DBAs or anyone who really wants to use SQL, because even data scientists will use SQL. And so we created this kernel, which is kind of focused, it's this dedicated SQL kernel, which allows for using a lot of the Monaco features with syntax highlighting and IntelliSense and things like that, and kind of see how this lands with the community. And it turned from an experience that DBAs really liked into something that they really loved. And so this kind of triggered this journey where we had to go talk to the Jupyter open source community, because we didn't want to just build things that only worked here, but think about how do we contribute a SQL kernel back into the rest of the world. And then also always asking the DBAs about how can we introduce them more to notebooks, because it's always a challenge, even in the Jupyter community today, of how do you bring on these new users, bring them along on this journey so that they could, find a way to incorporate this into their own workflows. And so this triggered focus groups, research studies, user calls, engagement on social media or on Twitter. You could feel free to tweet this presentation on Twitter right now. And also these long GitHub threads, and just trying to figure out how can we, unify these concepts, find similarities, and work with the open source community. And this kind of triggered this, this kind of high level view of all the scenarios, looking at both for data scientists and for DBAs, where, when you talk about Jupyter notebooks, like anywhere outside the context of SQL, you're really looking at like notebooks for data workflows. You're looking at like ML, looking at data prep, you're looking at operationalization with Papermill. But on this journey, we discovered things like notebooks as UX, where we have wizards kind of accompanying you as you're deploying Azure SQL for the first time, or having like this rich training to kind of train your team of how to get used to using a SQL server, or learning all the basic commands for it, or even using for troubleshooting. And yeah, these are all scenarios that we had to kind of keep in mind as we're building this out. So really quick here, I'm going to show a demo of Azure Data Studio in action. And this is what Azure Data Studio looks like. And I want to share this with you because I want you to kind of put on your DBA hat, understand what their world looks like as they traverse into notebooks. So, one thing that we learned from, managing SSMS for such a long time is that this is kind of right here where 90% of DBAs are spending their time. They need the ability to connect to things. They need the ability to manage things and kind of organize their connections. And then more importantly, they need the ability to write these long SQL queries, comment them, and then execute them as well. So, when they first, some of the limitations with this current experience is that, let's say that you're a DBA that wants to go share this with someone that doesn't really have the same access to databases like you, and you want to kind of just quickly have a bird's eye view of the results and which query it's from, and kind of how do I use the information from your SQL query and make data-driven decisions behind it. So that's kind of where notebooks kind of was like a light bulb moment. And when we showed this to people in user research studies, they were like, hey, you want us to use notebooks? Make it so easy for me to take my existing SQL queries and convert it into a notebook. So that's what we did with the latest release of Azure Data Studio, which comes out this month, where we added this button where you could convert any of your query files directly into a notebook. So we parse the SQL query file, identify anything that are comments and anything that is the query itself, and create your notebook so that, in terms of the adoption of SQL users to use notebooks, it's as easy as a click of a button. And here, they're already within the context of a SQL kernel. We can allow them to make a connection to a database. Change connection, sorry. I will connect to one of my SQL Server instances. And as you can see here, we already have syntax highlighting, which is not available through SQL Magic. We have things like IntelliSense, and we also can obviously run the result and then save the output of the result as part of the notebook metadata and share this out with any of our other, maybe on the business segment of our team. And that's kind of, what the workflow looks like or the benefits of having a SQL kernel available through Azure Data Studio. And in terms of kind of the reactions to this experience, it's just kind of caught like fire. Like these DBAs and SQL Server people just love this and just finding out more and more ways of how they can incorporate this into their workflows. At the same time, telling us where we can improve. Like, for example, they don't want the they cite some adoption frictions, like having to learn Markdown and having to look up this Markdown all the time. So we added some improvements really recently where you could as you're typing rich text here, we automatically convert it to Markdown for you, so you don't have to worry about looking at the syntax. So as if you're like writing an Outlook email, you can then interact with notebooks. Or if you want to like paste an image, if you wanted to paste an image from online, like this cute hamster here, and you wanted to paste this here, you don't have to remember any of the Markdown syntax for any GIFs, because once I exit the cell and view the Markdown here, we already convert it into Markdown for you. And that's kind of the beauty behind this experience, that we're always trying to learn more from our SQL customers. So now this kind of leads me, now that you kind of got a sense of the importance of having a SQL kernel and the kind of value that it could bring to the notebooks ecosystem, there was two pieces of feedback that not only kind of came from these GitHub issues and social media user research studies, as well as at JupyterCon, which we presented about a month ago. These were two of the really key takeaways, where one, they don't want this kernel available just in Azure Data Studio. They want this available in VS Code. They want this available in GitHub code spaces. They want this in Azure notebooks and just all over outside of even the Microsoft ecosystem too. How can we get this SQL kernel? And then on top of that, they want to take this one step further. I don't want just the ability to run SQL. I want to, for each code cell in there, I want to be able to run SQL, PowerShell, C#, or just any other languages, just so that I could have this one notebook where I could just run all the cells and I could do all the jobs and tasks that I need. So as we kind of thought about, instead of us having to custom build all this all the time, let's go back to our principles. How can we leverage open source? Can we build consistent experiences across Microsoft? And that's where .NET Interactive comes in. .NET Interactive is open source and already has support for C#, F#, and PowerShell. Now imagine if we, as the kind of experts in the T-SQL side, what if we could work with the .NET Interactive team to contribute T-SQL? So now you can use all these languages in the same notebook in any Jupyter notebook viewer out there. And so this, we had this conversation over the last 4 months, led to several hackathons, made a lot of progress, and we're really excited to kind of share the outcome of all that work. And John's going to take a moment here to talk about .NET Interactive.
Sure. Thanks, Alan. So .NET Interactive started out, it started out from the Try.NET project, which was effectively a code as a service tool that allows you to write interactive documentation. But the documentation tended to be something you had to write ahead of time. It wasn't as open-ended as a Jupyter notebook. And people kept saying, can we have Jupyter notebooks? We want to be able to add packages. We want to be able to define new dependencies on the fly and things like this. So at the same time, .NET, a lot of .NET developers, for similar reasons as what Alan was talking about with SQL, didn't want to have to go and learn Python. They wanted to use the tools they already knew, the languages that they were already familiar with. And as well, they had different workloads other than just data science workloads. So you see a lot of these operationalized things like PowerShell. So what we started out with was that was one of the reasons to go down the direction of doing Jupyter notebooks, but also to think about it in terms of polyglot. We wanted a kind of common base of experience and a common set of visualizations, magic commands, things like this, which typically will differ from one Jupyter kernel to another when they're specific to one language. We said we wanted to be able to share these things across different languages. So for C# and F#, We also wanted to be able to fill in some gaps in the story for visualization libraries, because there are some great visualization libraries out there, but for the most part, at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're building things in things like Plotly or D3.js, where you want to be able to write JavaScript. So we figured if we build from the ground up as a polyglot kernel, you can write those visualizations directly in JavaScript. The PowerShell team was already working with the Azure Data Studio team to provide crucial infrastructure for being able to do things in the control plane for DevOps workloads, which are a big differentiator for the .NET community. Reasons why people want to use .NET versus Python often has to do with that kinds of system administration and backend systems. So on top of all these, the kind of missing piece of the puzzle, we realized from talking to all of our friends and customers was SQL. So that's where we are here. We said, can we bring SQL into this polyglot mix? So with that in mind, I'd like to show you a demo of where we're at right now. So what you're seeing here is Visual Studio Code Insiders. The Visual Studio Code team has been working on a notebook interface, right, which is only available right now in Insiders. But what I'm showing is the .NET Interactive Notebooks extension for Visual Studio Code Insiders. So you can see that we've got this little language chooser here. Now, an important principle is that we want all these, even when you don't have a language chooser, because Jupyter doesn't have one, right? And we want this thing to be able to work in other contexts, is that I want to be able to change languages even without the language chooser. So we use magic commands for this. Now, magic commands are often used in Jupyter to trigger different kinds of functionality, and they may correspond to other languages. In .NET Interactive, these are actually different subkernels. So what we can see here, here we go, right, is that I've shell access. I get completions from the shell, and this is going to let us do really important work for all of our DevOps needs. So I can display this here, and now we can do some really important work in PowerShell. Now, we have facilities for sharing data and so on. I'm not going to go into that. This is sort of a different story, but what I want to show here is that using this magic command subkernel concept is that we can now start to think about how we bring in SQL kernels into this world, right, where we don't necessarily have a language chooser. So right now, this is a C# cell. # NuGet in .NET Interactive is a way to load in NuGet packages on the fly. So you can see here that I've installed a NuGet package, and NuGet packages can contain extensions to .NET Interactive. So they use the .NET Interactive APIs to change the behaviors of the workspace itself. So they can add magic commands. And in this case, they can add subcommands to an existing magic command. What the connect magic command does in .NET Interactive, and you could add your own extensions and add your own other connections as well. It allows you to create new kernels. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to be able to create a magic command. Let me grab my connection string. Now, the secrets sharing is one of those places where Azure Data Studio and .NET Interactive will hopefully share some infrastructure. You won't eventually have to paste a connection string in here. Obviously, that's a security issue. But for now, this is what we have. So now I have this AdventureWorks subkernel. Right? The AdventureWorks subkernel is a SQL subkernel. And I can now, I can type SQL directly in here, and I get IntelliSense, right? It's connected to my database, and I can run this. What you're seeing here, another thing that came in from our extension was the Interact Data Explorer. And we're using this, again, in order to have a common, because .NET Interactive is just a backend, right? And it'll work in all these different front ends. One of the things that we want to be able to do is carry our own custom visualizations that are associated with specific kinds of data. And so eventually what we'll want in Azure Data Studio is to be able to use the Azure Data Studio, its own data viewer. But here we have the ability as well to bring in an extension that brings in the Interact Data Explorer. Interact is a project that builds all these great components for Jupyter, and this is one of them. So let's try a little bit more of an interesting query now. I'm going to grab this from my other window here because it's a little bit trickier to type. Okay, so here's a bit more of a fun query. Oh, and I've been having this problem here where it doesn't recognize that, but here's what it looks like when it actually works. So what you can see here, right, and this, again, the IntelliSense all works. The Interact Data Explorer gives you some great ability to look at the shape of the data without having to write code to do the visualization. So if you don't know what you're looking for, you can kind of start to play around with it. And this is one example, so we can see, you know, a breakdown of how many items are in each of our orders. So I'm gonna go back to this other window here. Now, another thing about the ability to bring it to use magic commands to load subkernels dynamically is we can manage multiple connections in the same notebook this way. So I'm going to do this again. Now, in order to use some of the same metaphors between different languages in terms of SQL connections, some people want to query their database using SQL, obviously, and some people might want to query their database using C#. So you might have noticed before that we have this create DB context here. So what this is going to do is, you'll see here it's scaffolding a DB context, and it's dynamically pulling in references to entity framework in order to do this. Okay, so we still have the worldwide importers subkernel. We can send SQL directly to that, just like you saw with AdventureWorks. But we also, in the C# kernel, now we have this variable that was created for us, worldwide importers. Okay, so now I have an entity framework DB context that's ready to go. This right here, now I just evaluated that, so it treats it as effectively as an IEnumerable. It spins off query to the database, and what you're seeing here is the default .NET Interactive HTML output. But you saw the Interact Data Explorer before. We wanted to make, we're using that right now as the default output for a straight SQL query. But you can also use it, let's grab another more interesting query here. You can also use it for any IEnumerable. So here's, again, this slightly more interesting query. Right, so we've got customers by state. This is the default HTML output. But what I can also do is I've got this extension method that the extension lab brought in. This is the extension method that's going to, and we don't have documentation in place for that yet, but you'll see it soon. And this gives us the Interact Data Explorer. And so now we can come in here and we can start to look for, you know, things that are interesting about our data. You know, customers by state. Right, and so this is quite a powerful tool for exploring your data. And again, to create workflows that cross multiple languages. You'll be able to share data between SQL, between C#, PowerShell, and put together workflows to explore your data and reproduce that. And that's kind of the current evolution of the data story in .NET Interactive. Back to you, Alan.
Thanks, John. That's really awesome demo here. And what this really kind of highlights, or what you kind of saw here, was that in a single notebook, you're able to have PowerShell, you're able to have C#, if you notice that on the kind of the bottom right of the cell. We had T-SQL as well, all within the same notebook. And that's just such an exciting thing, because not only is, like you saw the demo in VS Code, but this will soon be available in Azure Data Studio and hopefully through Azure Notebooks and just all over the place. So, we're going to continue to work on this. There will be, keep an eye out for some announcements coming down the road. But really, this kind of highlights this partnership of Microsoft Teams coming together to really build consistent experiences and not kind of work in these silos where it feels like there's clear org line separations, but kind of trying to come all together, and then also validating with many of our open source community friends over in like Netflix and like Jupyter Books and just all over the place. And we're always trying to share any of our learnings, our research studies with them, so that one day we can all contribute this back to open source. So it's a quick thing. I really encourage all of you to just maybe take a moment, take a screenshot of this page and try to just check out the Azure Data Studio project. It's all on GitHub. Also check out the .NET Interactive project, which is also on GitHub. And more specifically, we have some instructions for you if you want to try out some of the things that you've seen today at this ak.ms link. SQL is not fully available, but just keep an eye out because we will have some announcements around that relatively soon. And yeah, without further ado, are there any other questions? Feel free to also follow us on Twitter.
You're muted, Abdul.
Whoops. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, John. That was amazing. The collaboration, the customer development process, both of those are just amazing. I got I got a couple of questions here, and I think one of them kind of summarizes a whole bunch of them. Is .NET Interactive an alternative? Oh, wait, that's another question that I want to ask. This is the question that I want to ask. What all the databases that the notebook supports right now?
So as of today, when you go and switch to the SQL kernel in Azure Data Studio, we actually support all like SQL Server, so both on-prem and on the cloud. So if you think about Azure SQL or also Synapse is also supported through that SQL kernel. In addition to that, we also support OSS databases too. So both on-prem Postgres and Azure Postgres. And then in the works is MySQL, but I'll give you a hint that also MySQL will be working all the same kernel. And that's kind of the beauty of it. As long as you have the appropriate extension installed for Postgres or whatnot, the SQL kernel is the only kernel you'll need to execute any SQL. At least for the .NET Interactive component, our first on our roadmap is T-SQL, obviously, and supporting SQL Server, both on-prem and cloud. The other ones will just kind of come on a case-by-case basis.
We also have a prototype version of SQLite for .NET Interactive, which is also part of the extension line project.
Cool. The next question, is .NET Interactive an alternative to LinkPad with additional features?
I think, so there are some overlaps there for sure. .NET Interactive is really a service backend. So you could imagine that LinkPad could be, it's both a front end and a back end, and it's got a very rich UI that's built specifically for that feature set, whereas .NET Interactive is intending to be code as a service. You send it code, you get back responses. It's very, very flexible. And so right now we're at the backend for the Synapse notebooks for .NET and .NET for Spark. We work inside of Jupyter, we work inside of Interact. You saw it working inside of Visual Studio Code Insiders, and it will eventually be inside of Azure Data Studio as well. So in that sense, there's some overlap there, but there's also a lot of difference in terms of their purpose. We also think that in the future iterations of Try.net, the backend will be .NET Interactive as well. All
right, great. Next question. What's the maximum number of examples you could store in a notebook?
How much RAM do you have? Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think this is going to be a question for the VS Code insiders. And as you start piling up more and more complex notebooks, then they will fix the bugs for us, I hope.
Great. Yeah, same thing for Azure Data Studio. We're going through some perf testing and things like that, but yeah, it depends kind of on your machine limitations and things like that.
All right.
One of the things that's actually really interesting that the VS Code team has done here is that they've virtualized the viewport. So the reason, and a big, you may have used the Python notebook support in Visual Studio Code, and that was sort of a UI that they had built themselves, but it had some performance problems as you start to pile up more and more cells because the Monaco editor is fairly heavyweight. So they're moving as well to the VS Code native notebook experience, which virtualizes the viewport and gets a lot more performance out of it.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. When will the .NET kernel be included with ADS?
As soon as we can. We're working as fast as we can with John's team, and as long as Diego and Maria, I want to give them shout outs as well because we've been working together over the last 4 months for some time. But yeah, it's like we're going to work as quickly as we can. Like actually, you can download .NET Interactive through Azure Data Studio, but in terms of also having the full support with SQL, that's TBD. But at this time, you can download .NET Interactive. It will work in Azure Data Studio, but it would only be for C#, PowerShell, and F# at this time. The SQL announcement will come shortly.
All right, cool. I guess that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much again, Alan and John. That was amazing. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Abdullah.
Yeah, thanks for having us.